Dear colleagues and students, welcome to the 9th Education webinar of the Distinguished Speakers webinar series on Special and Inclusive Education. My name is Lefki Kourea and I will be coordinating today's webinar. This is a free webinar series organized by the Department of Education of the University of Nicosia. It aims to connect education communities with experts on topics around empirically based educational practices and new methodologies for improving the quality of life of students with disabilities and their families. These webinars provide an opportunity to interact with leading scholars whose research has significantly impacted the field of education over the years. We can discuss with our speakers synchronously via YouTube and Facebook chat. I strongly encourage you to post your questions and comments in the chat box, either in English or in Greek, and I will address them to today's speakers at the end of the presentation. Our today's speaker is Professor Kathleen Lynne from University of Kansas. We thank her very much for accepting this invitation and sharing her expertise and knowledge about behavioral issues in school context. Kathleen Lynne is a Roy Roberts Distinguished Professor in the Department of Special Education and Associate Vice Chancellor for Research. Dr. Lynne's research interests focus on designing, implementing, and evaluating comprehensive, integrated, three-tier models of prevention to prevent the development of learning and behavior challenges and to support at-risk students. She has published widely and extensively, having 11 books, 211 referee journal articles, and 42 book chapters. During this year, the Council for Exceptional Children honored Dr. Lynne for her lifetime of achievement and dedication to improving outcomes for students with and at risk for emotional and behavior disorders and the educators who serve them. Professor Lynne's presentation today focuses on meeting students' multiple needs in comprehensive, integrated three-tiered, in other words, CI3T models of prevention, the importance of systematic screening. Dr. Lynne will focus on how to use the CI3T model to meet student needs in an integrated tier systems with emphasis on academic, behavior, and socio-emotional well-being using empirically based resources. Professor Lynne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today. It is truly an honor, and I look forward to the time with you. In the chat, I am sharing a website link that will share many of the resources here. And I appreciate you posting that as you have just a moment. In today's time together, I'm looking forward to sharing with you a little bit about CI3T, as you just learned. And I would like to tell you up front before we get started that everything that I'm sharing today is available to you on this website. And this has been studied widely in the United States of America. If you would like to have today's presentation, if you click on the tab that says presentation, you are welcome to download this, and it is editable. So you are welcome to use it in your classes and in your professional learning resources. In addition, I would like to show you some other free access resources that are available on this website. And again, it's www.ci3t.org. And as we launch today, I also want to say that during the pandemic that we've all been mitigating and living through the last couple of years, we added a different page to our website that supported hundreds, if not thousands, of educators across the United States and beyond in using this CI3T structure to pivot to respond to remote, in-person, and hybrid learning environments during the pandemic. Those resources remain there for you if you would like, and I'll share a little bit more about those with you as we move forward. And I also wanted to thank you before we get started just for the warm welcomes in the comment sections. I'm not able to respond directly, but please know that I appreciate your graciousness and welcoming me here today. As I was introduced, I am currently a professor, but I am a former classroom teacher, and I had the opportunity to work with middle school age students, which are 6th, 7th, and 8th in the United States, as well as teach at the elementary level. And much of this work that I'm going to be describing today has been situated from preschool all the way through 12th grade within the United States. So today, what we're going to do in the next hour together is we're going to introduce CI3T. I'd like to explain what this means to me. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the work that's been done to date. So we're going to start by just describing what this structure looks like. And then we're going to have an emphasis on systematic screening to inform instruction. And the screening we're talking about today is mostly screening to support students' emotional well-being. So we'll be talking specifically about behavior screenings that are done for every single student in fall, winter, and spring. And we'll talk about how to use those data to shape instruction at Tier 1. And in addition to empower educators to really feel confident and competent in their classroom management skills to maximize engagement and minimize disruption and build positive, productive relationships with all students, including those that are receiving special education supports. So let's go ahead and jump in. First and foremost, I'd like to just thank you for your commitment to being here. I know time is a very precious gift, and I appreciate you giving yours to me today so that we could have this time together to learn about the current practices about how to look for kids at the very first sign of concern. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the context in the United States. If you were to take a picture right now, actually pre-pandemic, if you were to take a picture in the United States, you would find that approximately 20% of all students in the United States have some form of internalizing or externalizing behavior challenges. Internalizing meaning shy, anxious, or withdrawn, and externalizing meaning acting out, non-compliant. And usually it ranges from very mild issues to more severe issues. And if you look at those two circles, you'll notice that there's a degree of overlap. There's been research done to show us that there are kids that often you most recognize them for their outward directed behavior challenges like externalizing behaviors. But if you were to peel that back, you would also notice that they underneath that also have internalizing issues. So when we think about the work that is to be done in terms of supporting kids' academic and behavioral needs, we know that we need to address these together because there's a very large percentage of kids that do struggle behaviorally. And in the United States of America, less than 1% of those kids go on to receive special education services under the category of emotional disturbance. So sometimes teachers used to think, oh, I don't have to worry about supporting kids that have behavior challenges in my classroom. They're going to get support through special education services. And that is simply not the case. Most students that struggle behaviorally actually receive all their education as part of the general education experience. And so the good news is that in the last several years, there's been a shift away from thinking about this as a within child challenge. And instead, we've been focusing on a systems perspective to meet students' multiple needs. This triangle that you're looking at is an image of a CI3T triangle, comprehensive integrated three-tiered models of prevention. And this model is made up of 3 domains. It puts everything together into one system. And this is designed to support collaboratively students that have both exceptionalities and students that have general education needs. So at the base of it is academics. The behavior part is positive behavior intervention and supports, which is called PBIS, and that has both a proactive and a reactive piece. And in addition, it addresses social and emotional well-being. And so right now I'm going to tell you a little bit about what this model looks like. And as part of it, there's also a plan for what to do for students that needs more than Tier 1 has to offer. So those students might need what is called a Tier 2 or a secondary prevention effort, or they might need the most intensive intervention support, which is a Tier 3 support. When I share this information today, it might sound a little lofty and be like, oh my goodness, how am I going to get this done? But I want you to know it has been widely studied in partnership with thousands of educators and students across the country. And what I'm bringing you today is these lessons that have been learned thus far regarding CI3T, regarding the implementation, how data are used on every single student to know who needs more than Tier 1 has to offer, and creating this clarity, this plan about how to know which students need additional support, and creating a way for teachers to partner together with administrators so that they can build positive, productive learning environments and meet students' multiple needs. So as we think about what's at the base of CI3T, first in this blueprint, if you would, it's kind of like a constitution or a blueprint for this school and how it functions. And at the base, there's clarity on academics. So there's attention given to determining what do you want to accomplish academically with students, and how much time am I going to put into the days of the classroom life for students from preschool to high school, so that I know what I want to address. And in that, there's an emphasis on low intensity supports, things like building in instructional choices, using behavior specific praise to increase engagement and minimize disruption. Then central to this model is positive behavior intervention and support. And there's another wonderful website, and it is called pbis.org. And that particular website is generated from the National Center on Positive Behavior Intervention and Support. And that is at the cornerstone, the centerstone of a CI3T model. And in this, as part of their CI3T plan, they build expectations that are taught to every single student in the school. So to accomplish this, we actually have a tool called the School-Wide Evaluation Survey for specific settings. And on that website that I first mentioned on ci3t.org, if you go to the Measures tab, you are welcome to download that and you can use that tool. And what it's done is it's used to survey every single adult in the building so that they can figure out what kids need to know to be successful. PBIS isn't something that you buy. It is something that you build based on the value and the culture of your community. And then these expectations are organized in these expectation matrices like the one you're looking at now. And these are widely displayed across school settings. So they're in the classrooms, they're in the hallways, they're in cafeterias, they're in non-instructional areas. And this becomes a teaching tool. So every single teacher teaches these expectations to every kid so they know what is needed to be successful in the classrooms, in the hallways, in the cafeterias, and even in the restroom. And so kids are given opportunity to practice and receive acknowledgments for meeting these expectations. And there's a plan for responding respectfully when challenging behaviors do come up. Another core piece of CI3T, in addition to these established, clearly defined expectations, is the idea of meeting kids' social and emotional well-being needs. So throughout this building process, there's a team from each school that comes together, and they review validated resources to see what type of resource or curriculum can I bring into my building, and that it is taught just like academics is taught, behavior is taught, and so are these skills to support social and emotional well-being. And so some of you may have heard of the CASTLE framework, where you're teaching kids to be self-aware, to self-manage themselves, to engage in responsible decision-making, to be aware socially, and then to build relationships with others. And so as part of this building process for CI3T, the idea is to bring in these explicit skills that get taught, again, at tier 1 to every single student in the building, because we know so much of school is social. And so the idea is kids learn how to engage in these positive, productive ways with their fellow peers and with their educators. And we know when they master these skills, you see fewer behavior challenges, less emotional stress, and more academic success for students. And in a CI3T model, our goal isn't to convince somebody to pick a particular program. We actually work through something called What Works Clearinghouse. And What Works Clearinghouse is something developed by the Institute of Education Science. And what they've done, it's this wonderful set of resources where the people have vetted all the research for practitioners, so that it is, they have these little research briefs and practice guides so that you can look to see what makes the most sense for my community. And once that's identified, then that particular resource is brought in at tier 1. And now when you think about what is CI3T, this is the base of CI3T. It's clarity and a plan as to what every single student is going to experience academically, behaviorally, and in terms of social and emotional well-being. So when every kid comes to school, whether it's preschool, elementary, middle, or high school, this is all dressed in an integrated fashion. And as part of this blueprint, there's an idea behind it to explain to people, here's what you need to know. So there's information for faculty and staff, the educators in the building. There's information for what students need to know, their families, as well as administrators and what the administrators are accountable for. And even when all this is in place, there is certainly going to be some kids that need more than Tier 1 has to offer. So as part of this plan, there's a set of integrated interventions that build on this work at Tier 1, and they increase in intensity. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more, but there will be students that have Tier 2 needs, which are a little bit higher intensity, and then there'll be students that have Tier 3 needs. And in this model, students on an IEP are not necessarily in Tier 3. So students that receive special education services are part of every level of prevention, along with the general education community. And I know one of the questions that was shared earlier is, how is CI3T related to special education? CI3T is a system for the entire school system. So instead of having well-intended people on different committees trying to meet kids' needs in different ways, this is one integrated leadership team that comes together after going through a year-long building experience to design their CI3T implementation manual. And this graphic actually illustrates the process by which an entire academic year is spent to build that blueprint that I was just telling you about. So in a school building, what they would do if the larger district decided they wanted to go forward with CI3T, what they would do is they would put together a CI3T leadership team at a school. And that person would have the principal, the person that's in charge at the school, 2 general education teachers, a special education teacher, a parent, and the child of that parent if they're 8 years old or above. And they would come together through these sessions, although the students only come to sessions 3 and 5. And they alternate between 2-hour sessions held after schools and full day. And it spans the entire academic year. So the team comes together in these 6 sessions. And then afterwards, after each session, they go back and work with other members of their faculty and staff to get input on what they think about the information that's being built. And one interesting that I noticed, and Christian, thanks for the heart, I appreciate that. One interesting to note is that along the way, this whole thing is a data-informed approach. So that SES survey that I mentioned that every adult in the building completes before they come to the training series, they actually use those data to start building out what the CI3T plan is going to look for. And after session 4, there's a draft of that whole Tier 1 experience. And there's a survey that goes out that's called the Primary Intervention Rating Scales. And interestingly enough, a school's mean score on that particular measure actually predicts how well that faculty and staff will implement this plan the following year. And so as you're looking at this, you think, geez, that's a long time to build out the entire experience. And it is, because you're actually pivoting a change in the entire system where you're organizing all the happenings to create transparency and clarity of what's available to all students, to some, and for a few. This illustration is a graphic that it illustrates how one particular district rolled out their CI3T implementation manual and how they roll out their building process. And what they did is, in their experiences in 2013 and 2014, they started by training all 14 elementary schools in their district. And then when those schools started to implement, as represented by that dark green square or rectangle, then the next year, that same year, the middle and high schools in that district then began to build their CI3T implementation manual and implemented the next year. And then finally, their college and career center did the same. So one of the questions that also came up earlier is, does this work with students in middle and high school? And the answer is absolutely yes. So whether they're preschool all the way to high school, the idea would be spend a year building, 2 years of focus implementation, and then move into sustainability. So what do we mean by an implementation manual? What it looks like is at the end of this year, people have a concrete blueprint for their school that if anybody picked it up inside the pages of these CI3T implementation manuals, it levels the playing field for every adult that's hired and every family that goes to that school and the students that are there themselves to say, this is how we're planning to meet your students' academic, behavior, and social and emotional well-being needs. If you were to open up one of these manuals before anything is built in it, you would see a series of blueprints. And if you would like to look at these blueprints, there's a tab on the CI3T website. And again, it's CI3T, and it's CI3T.org. You could download, if you'd like, the 5 blueprints that are essentially empty pages that you go through this manualized building process to organize all the happenings in your building. So when you open this up, And if you want to look at a completed one, there's one on the COVID tab. There's an example for elementary, middle, and high school. In it, people work through this manualized process that's described in this book, and as well as an interactive ebook. They develop their mission statement for their school, the purpose of what they're trying to accomplish, and then they go through and create some clarities for students in terms of roles and responsibilities, and the same for faculty and staff and families, etc. So I want to show you a little bit about what this could look like. So under the academic column, one of the things that is listed there is information for the adults to know, what am I supposed to do if I get hired to come work in this middle school or this elementary school? What am I responsible for? So in addition to saying like you're responsible for 90 minutes of English and language arts instruction, another important piece of this is empowering every educator to learn how to do these low intensity supports that are designed to increase engagement and minimize disruption. And I want to tell you that those things, like increasing kids' opportunities to respond, using behavior-specific praise, doing academic supervisions, using pre-correction, you don't stop instruction to do those. Those things are woven into the fabric of your daily instruction. So that's part of your academic domain. In addition, those expectation matrices are used as teaching tools. And in the COVID era, people even had those projected on these screens like you're seeing right now. Like if I was teaching in the COVID era, I'd have these expectations listed here about how to be respectful, how to be responsible, how to be engaged or be safe, so that it doesn't matter if they're in person or remote, you're teaching kids up front how to play the school game. So you want to make sure that we're leveling the field for kids. And then in terms of the social and emotional well-being piece, whatever curricular resource you decide to bring into your schools, and this afternoon, I'll actually be working with a school that is a district that's actually heading into their 9th year next year of CI3T implementation. And they've decided to change the resource that they're using. So they're bringing a group of people today from their district and the community, and they're going to begin this review process to make some decisions about what to bring in. And then just like we teach academics, the lessons in these curricula are shared with every single student at tier 1. So you're teaching kids those skills that they need to do well in their interrelationships with others and become self-determined lifelong learners. What you're looking at now is an example of what one piece of a CI3T implementation manual, and in it, as I mentioned, it has some clarities about how I'm going to teach math or English and language arts, how I'm going to use low intensity support so I can increase engagement, minimize disruption. There's also a plan for responding respectfully to challenging behaviors, because we know so much of school relies on building strong, positive relationships with students. And in addition, there's also clarity in terms of what I'm going to do in terms of how I'm going to teach those social skills. So in one of the high schools that we worked with, they partnered with 2 high schools actually, and they did a lesson in first period. So the first lesson was taught by first period teachers. And then the next week, second period taught the second lesson. And then the third week was taught by the third period teachers. So they literally put those instructional blocks throughout all 7 periods that the students access. And that communicated to every kid in the building that this is important enough that every teacher is going to be engaged in teaching you this. So when we talk about teaching in a CI3T system, it is ideally inclusive. And the intent is to use these strategies in an integrated way. So I'm weaving together academics, behavior, and social and emotional well-being. And I'm going to first teach all the adults how to do this so that the adults then teach the students. And just as we want to, change how instruction's happening, we need to make sure that we're recognizing the adults in the building for taking this on. So in addition to recognizing students for meeting expectations using that PBIS structure where you're giving them an acknowledgement, oftentimes a ticket, and you're telling them what they did that was of value, that was expected. You do the same with adults. And then, and this is a big part of what we're going to talk about today, once this whole thing's in place, we want to know 3 things. We want to know, is it happening? What people think about it? And how is it working for students? So again, just to quickly reiterate, I'm going to teach these procedures at tier 1. So I'm going to teach those expectations so that kids can be successful in every setting. When we talk about integrated lessons, when teachers are preparing what to teach for kids, in addition to thinking about academics, we also want to think about like, what could I pre-correct for them? What behavior skill sets will they need to use to really engage responsibly and enjoy this instruction? And then what am I going to use in terms of those low intensity supports to really maximize their engagement and minimize disruptions? And these are very practical strategies that can be learned by all educators and family members and put into instruction. So you can think about these as being tools in people's toolkits. And oftentimes, at least in American systems, the main reason why people leave the field is not because they don't know how to teach. It's because they feel overwhelmed by managing the behavior that sometimes show up that disrupts instruction. So these types of strategies have a lot of evidence behind them to suggest that if I do these while I'm teaching, I'm less likely to experience challenging behaviors. When we talk about reinforcement, we're actually thinking about recognizing kids using a ticket. So I might hand kids a ticket and say, I appreciate you being on time. Thank you for getting your work done. Or I appreciated the way you work with your friend on that. And it's not for exceeding expectation, it's for meeting expectations. And in that reinforcement structure, we want to make sure that we're doing things like reinforcing effort and not ability. So we want to reinforce things that are within that student's control. And this is actually partly how we build students' intrinsic motivation, is that we teach them that what you do and what you don't do impacts what your experience is like in schools. So this is a part of the reinforcement structure. And in addition to reinforcing the students in the building, we also want to reinforce the adults. This is a picture of one very talented principal that I've enjoyed working with now across 2 districts. And she inspires me. And when the pandemic happened, she actually took the time to send out digital postcards like these. She would send them to her faculty and staff, and sometimes she would send them with these little tiny 20-second video recordings so that they knew what they were being recognized for. So she took a moment to acknowledge and appreciate the adults in her building. So now let's think about this. We've clarified what we're going to teach academically, behaviorally, and socially. And then we've given people an opportunity to receive acknowledgement for meeting those expectations. And now there's 3 things that we want to make sure as we're monitoring this. The first thing is social validity. It is imperative that you check twice a year in fall and in spring so that everybody that's supporting instruction with kids, they have an opportunity to give input on what they think about the goals, the procedures, and how well it's working, the outcomes. So there's a survey called the Primary Intervention Rating Survey. It's that same one that's used during the building process so that the adults in the building can give input on how implementation is going, what they think about the goals, the procedures, and the outcomes. And in addition to social validity, they also assess treatment integrity. So they tell you through these surveys, here is what I'm doing in terms of teaching. Here is what I'm doing in terms of reinforcing. And here's how I'm using my data. And in addition to that self-report, there's also direct observations in classrooms for about 25% of the classrooms. And some schools do more than 25%, but you're trying to get a glimpse inside the classroom. So there's many tiered systems focus on just one score for the school as a whole. In the CI3T model, you can take a glimpse into classrooms to see what implementation looks like, because we know it's going to vary in different classrooms. And then to know how this is going for students, we also need to look at academic and behavior screening. And this is a focus of what we're going to visit about today. But in the behavior screening piece, whereas academic screening, it's these short little assessments with all students from preschool to high school. They typically take just a couple minutes in fall, winter, and spring. In a CI3T model, we also use teacher-completed behavior screenings, and those are used to assess both major disorders of childhood, those kids that are more like internalizing, shy, anxious, or withdrawn, as well as kids that struggle more with acting out behavior. These require no time with kids, so they're not chewing away at your instructional time. They're very brief. And the one I'm going to show you today takes literally 15 to 20 minutes to screen every single student in your school. So it's not a lot of time, and it gives valuable information that is used to connect kids to tier 2 and ultimately tier 3 supports. Also in this CI3T model, there is clarity on what to do for kids that need more than tier 1 has to offer. And I want to reassure you, if you wind up Having students that need more than Tier 1 has to offer doesn't mean you're a bad teacher or it's a bad school or a bad environment. That means that child needed a little more, and that is okay. And so in a CI3T system, there's not a separate list for what to do academically or behaviorally or socially. It's all woven in together into one integrated list to support those extra supports. And similarly, at Tier 3, these are reserved for students with the most intensive intervention needs. So these are reserved for things like functional assessment-based interventions or very intensive interventions for students that have multiple needs. And when you think about building this whole system, I want you to be reassured this absolutely takes time, in the sense that we have the building process, we have initial implementation, and then we go into sustained implementation. So this is going to be a journey, and it's going to take time to do, but you're creating this opportunity for everybody to engage in positive, productive learning environments. So when we think about the benefits of this, if you think about the school that you're working in or the district that you're working in, and you think about what a gift it could be to have clarity for every single educator as to here's what we do to support all students, some, and for very few. And by the some, I mean Tier 2 support. So typically you would expect about 15 to 20% of students to need that type of support. And then Tier 3 supports are reserved for students with the most intensive intervention needs. And that's usually between 3 to 5% of your student body. I'm going to show you a couple of times and conversations that I'm going to encourage you after you leave this webinar today. I'm going to encourage you to block out about an hour of planning time on your own in your own personal calendar to reflect. And one of the first things I'm going to encourage you to think about is, as you're listening to this content today, you have some of these pieces already in place in your school system. So I'm going to invite you to think about, what are the wonderful things that you already have in place? And what are the things that are new that might be opportunities to grow and consider about doing? So if you would, go ahead and jot down this question on a note or on an electronic Word document so that you could come back to this later. What do you think you already have in place in your building? And when the time comes, I'm going to invite you to give about 5 minutes to that conversation. Now, what I'd like you to do, if you don't mind, is thinking about all that you've heard about academics, behavior, and social and emotional well-being. Will you go ahead and put a comment in the comment feature to say, here's the pieces that I feel like we already do well in your building. Do you feel like you have clarity of what's expected academically? Do you have expectations that are just taught to students? Do you address social and emotional well-being? Like, do you do lessons on that? And if you do, just take a moment, if you would, and drop that information in the chat. Thank you. And now what I'd like to do is I would like to focus for the next little block of time more specifically about how systematic screening can be conducted within a CI3T system. So I'm going to give you a little bit about an overview of what systematic screening tools are like. And specifically, we're going to be talking about universal behavior screenings. And if you would, I would appreciate it very much if you would keep an open mind about how you could use these data to inform what you do for all students, how you can empower educators with these low intensity supports, and then how you could use this information to connect kids to supports. So let's go ahead and jump into that. This content that I'm going to share with you today, you can also find on ci3t.org. There's a tab called Systematic Screening. And if you would, you are welcome to click on that tab, and you're going to see a listing of many different screening tools, one of which I'm going to discuss with you today, not necessarily because I think it's the best one, but because it is a free access screening tool that is widely used and widely available. So let me tell you a little bit about what this screening tool looks like. It is called the Student Risk Screening Scale for Internalizing and Externalizing Behavior Patterns. And the original 7 items were initially developed by a man named Tom Drummond, who was at the University of Oregon. And since that time, there have been an additional 5 items added, so that it's designed to collect information about acting out behaviors as well as internalizing issues. And as I mentioned, does not require any time with kids. So you're not talking to a kid to ask them questions. You're not you're not giving them something to fill out. This is a teacher completed measure. And the way it works is that for every single student in the school, they are rated by one teacher. So at an elementary school, it might be like the main homeroom teacher. At the middle and high school levels, it is one teacher. And usually there's a certain time of day. So anybody that's enrolled in the class right before lunch, or perhaps the very first class of the day or the last class of the day, the teacher receives a listing of students in their class. It's usually pre-populated with names and ID numbers, and then they rate each student across the top. Then each student's total scores. Oh, and I want to say one thing here as well. When you look at these items, you're not saying that a student like is a stealer or somebody that doesn't tell the truth. You're looking to see, do these behaviors occur together and to a high enough degree? Because when these behaviors co-occur, that is what predicts important outcomes for kids. So the way this works is at the elementary school and at the middle school, they are summed together in different ways. So for example, at the elementary school, you add up the first 7 items, and that score is used to put students into high, low, moderate, or high risk categories, and the same for internalizing. And I want to say, as you're thinking about doing this at the middle and high school, it's the same 12 items, but they are added up differently because we've learned that peer rejection becomes more typical of kids with internalizing issues at middle or high schools. What you're looking at right now are data from one school. Then the school implemented its CI3T beginning in fall of 2014. And as you can see, these represent fall screening data for a number of years, all the way from fall 2014 to fall 2021. And these triangles represent the percentage of students in this building that have low, moderate, and high risk for externalizing behavior patterns. And if you look at this trend over time, after from well before COVID to now, you see that the percentage of kids that have a tier 2 or tier 3 needs is decreasing over time, and the percentage of kids that are in the low risk category is increasing over time. And I have to say, in traditional tiered systems, oftentimes people rely on office discipline referral data to determine who needs more than tier 1 has to offer. So they typically take office discipline referrals. And if a student has 0 to 1, they're considered to score in the low risk or green category. If they've earned 2 to 5, then they are in the moderate risk. And if they have 6 or more, they're considered in the high risk. These screening tools are very similar to academic screening tools, except for the fact, as I mentioned, there's no direct time with students. And the second thing is that fall time point doesn't take place until the student has been enrolled for school and attending school for 4 to 6 weeks. So time passes, the kids about 4 to 6 weeks in, then the teachers complete this. And again, they do it in fall, winter, and spring, and they're using it like this. Now, I feel pretty confident that most kids with acting out, that externalizing behavior patterns, they're easy to recognize in a classroom and in a school because their behaviors are quick to capture teacher attention. But the kids that I most worry about as a researcher and as a mother are kids with internalizing issues, those kids that have like excessive shyness or are socially withdrawn or very anxious, because those kids often do not do things that capture teachers' attention, but it doesn't mean that their behavior challenges are any less serious. By doing these systematic screenings, you can quickly detect in just a few moments which kids are at heightened risk. And it's just a screener. So it's not an extensive diagnostic, but this does give us information on how kids are faring. So you can see, and this is the same school, and just as they had here, about half the kids that were having tier 1 needs for acting out behavior, they had even fewer kids that were in the low risk category for internalizing issues. And same thing, over time, when they are teaching social and emotional well-being, when they're teaching expected behavior, when they are using those low intensity supports to increase engagement and minimize disruption, we see that the percentage of kids that have tier 2 and tier 3 needs is decreasing over time. Now, this is not a randomized control trial, so you cannot draw any conclusions about whether it was CI3T or something else causing it. I'm just showing you descriptive data, but I do want to show you that progression over time. And now, if you are somebody that is a school psychologist, a counselor. Rather than having to go to a teacher to say, is there anybody that you think needs support? You can use these data to not only look at the school as a whole, but also to inform decisions about who might need more than Tier 1 has to offer. In addition to looking at those triangles, kind of showing you the overall school as a whole, you can also unpackage this information to see what does it look like at the kindergarten level or at the first grade level or second and all the way up through 12th grade. So for example, in this particular school, I can see that if I had to make a decision right now as to how to focus intervention efforts at Tier 2 and Tier 3, I can see that kindergarten and first grade, about 95% of their kids are all in the having Tier 1 needs. They're in pretty good shape. And 80% is our goal. But if I had to pick one place to do a little extra support, it would be second grade in the school, because look at the percentage of kids that have needs here at Tier 2 relative to the kids in kindergarten and first grade. So it's a way to quickly unpackage where the overall levels of risk are in a building. And we have done extensive studies, as have other research teams at this point, and we have learned that those fall scores, so that those scores that are completed by teachers, and it's one independent rating by a teacher where they rate every single student in their class, we have learned that those fall scores actually predict how the kids do at the end of the year. So we know that the kids that start the year at higher risk for behavior challenges are more likely to have lower oral reading fluency scores. They're more likely to visit the nurse, and they're more likely to be suspended. And the same is true for internalizing issues. So those fall scores predict similar academic and behavioral outcomes for students. And sometimes it's not as easy to distinguish between students and the moderate or high risk at this level, but we see that progression. These data represent the first 7 items from the student risk screening scale. They started off screening with the original 7 items that I mentioned for Tom Drummond. And you see this school started screening in 2004 and continued. I'm showing you data through 2012. And I want to show you that these data represent every single student in the school, again, placing into low, moderate, and high risk category. And so you see that as they were implementing CI3T over time, again, the percentage of kids that were struggling got smaller and smaller. Now, I often like to look at this 2008, and it reminds me of those weight loss commercials about, weight results may not be typical. You would expect not less than 1% of the kids to have high risk or have intensive intervention needs. You would instead predict it to be about 3 to 5%. But in general, one of the things that I noticed here with this school is the next year when it started to go up, one of the things that they did is they went back and looked at their treatment integrity data to see what was going on. And they realized that as they had been onboarding new teachers into their building, they hadn't trained them when they were hiring them, when they were onboarding them, to know what was happening at Tier 1. So what they did is they did a re-education for all the teachers about what to do at Tier 1, academically, behaviorally, and socially. And so they had that opportunity to reteach it. And as soon as they did, it went right back up. Now, in this particular moment, you can see that the percentage of kids in the low risk category is increasing. And in their very first year, this is actually one of the first middle schools in the United States that used this screening tool, because it was originally designed for use at the elementary level. They redid the same predictive validity analyses, and I want to show you what this looks like. So they took every single student that was screened at the beginning of the year, and then they waited till the end of the year to collect this information. So if you go back and look at this was the 422 kids right here. It's these same kids right here. By the end of the school year, those kids had earned on average 1.5 office discipline referrals. The kids that started off the year in the moderate risk, by the end of the year, they had earned 5 office discipline referrals, each of which involves being removed from a class. And kids that began the very beginning of the year at the high risk, they earned on average 8. And so we know that those fall scores predicted how kids did behaviorally. And if you look at these grade point averages and course failures, look at the grade point average, 3.35, 2.63, 2.31. We know that those fall scores also predicted academic success. So if they started off the year at higher risk, that was reason to pay attention, because even in the middle school years, it actually predicted the number of classes that kids failed over time. So you have to ask yourself the question, is it worth 15 minutes of teachers' time 3 times a year to figure out who is going to struggle behaviorally and who is going to struggle academically? Unequivocally, the answer is yes. Since that time, those results have been replicated. And again, those fall data predict not only course failures and suspensions and office discipline referrals. They also predict the number of visits that a child spends making to the nurse's office. And it's not that the nurse is a bad person, but the fact that they need to go there and miss that instruction, that is problematic. So we know those fall internalizing and externalizing scores are useful to being able to shape instruction. These are data that one high school teacher sent to us after several years of screening, and I thought it was so interesting. This is internalizing, and I remember the email that came from this gentleman. His name was Bill. He said, Kathleen, you've got to look at this. Look at the percentage of kids in the low risk category. It went up, up, up. The kids in the moderate risk category, they went from 10% to 4 to 3. And then similarly, the kids in the high risk category also decreased. And the same was true for externalizing behavior patterns. And this was in a high school with about 1,800 kids, 1,800 plus. So these are just to show you very practically, these data can be collected and they can be used to look at trends over time. At elementary, middle, and high school, these same scores predict how kids do. So the upside of this, the benefit to screening, is that we're not waiting for kids to earn all those office discipline referrals or get suspended or experience that academic underachievement. We can use those data to connect kids to supports. And I hope you're somewhat excited to explore systematic screening because it is not used to exclude, it is used to shape instruction so that you can meet kids' needs, their multiple needs, in an integrated fashion. But we need to do so carefully. We need to think about issues of security and how it's going to be shared. And we need to make sure that every kid that needs to be screened is given an opportunity to be screened, provided that they've been enrolled for at least that 30-day period before that first screening window. So there's a lot of practicalities to consider. And on the website, you can find not only examples of this one tool and others, and some of them are commercially available and they come with wonderful parallel intervention materials. But we want to make sure that if you are going to screen, that you've got a plan to intervene. And we've got to have a plan also for sharing that information back out with educators. So these are examples of templates that can be used. You can download these from our website, and then you can simply update those with your systematic screening data as well. So when we think about screening, some big ideas are they're teacher completed. They do not take time away from instruction. They are used to shape instruction, and they are not used to exclude. They're actually used to detail what I need to do as an educator to support those kids' needs while I'm teaching. And as I mentioned, they can also be unpackaged to look at the school as a whole. They can also be unpackaged to look at like certain grade levels to see if there's any areas of need, like following the post-pandemic era that we are coming out of. We know that there's many kids that have had no consistent formal education from their beginning years. We would expect that they will likely be experiencing some learning loss, and we need to know what to do with them. And we also want to emphasize that it is simply a screener. So it is not going to tell you everything you need to know about how to intervene. So on this page, again, I want to reiterate that if you were to click there, I've just shown you one of several tools that are available that you could go on to explore to learn more about systematic screening. There's short little informational videos if you'd like to learn more about screening in the COVID era. And there are also information resources available. Everything is free so that if you wanted to get started with coaching others to learn how to do systematic screening or how to set that up and make sure that the data are secured and safe, you are welcome to do that. And this is all made possible by our funder, the most recent thing called Project Screen It, which also funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. So if you would, in your notes, if you are taking any notes from today, I'd love for you to budget time in your calendar for another 15-minute block of your precious time to think about what could be some of the benefits to doing systematic screening. Things like knowing what kids need, having a snapshot for my school as a whole, knowing if I need to intervene at tier 1 or if I need to go to provide additional support to teachers that are suggesting that they're working with kids that are really posing some significant challenges, or using that information to connect kids to supports. And I also want you to think about some of the considerations for screening. Like, are you ready to screen? We don't want to screen and then not use the data, because that would not be wise to say to a parent, we've screened and we know your child needs more than tier 1 has to offer, but we don't have anything yet. So we don't want to do that. So we do want to have that balance. So I'm going to give you just a moment to catch your breath. And if you would, go ahead and jot down this question for yourself. What are some of the benefits and challenges of systematic screening? And I'd love for you to calendar out about 15 minutes of your time to think about what that might look like. Then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about actually how to use these data. So now let's assume you've built your CI3T model. You are screening. In addition to these behavior screenings, you'd also have academic screening, which are really important because we need that information to know how to best support these students. So I want to just show you just briefly some of the ways these information can be used. So one, I can use them to see how tier 1 is working in my building. And I can use that information to connect kids reliably and accurately to additional support. If these were your data in your school, this is reading, math, pro-social behavior, and motivation to learn. If when you screened the elementary school that you're working with, or the middle or the high, if it looked like this means I have far more kids that have tier 2 needs. And this would not be a good place to start at tier 2. If I only had about 45% of my kids on point in reading or math or in pro-social behavior, this tells me I should focus my efforts on tier 1. I need to go in and clean up what's happening at tier 1, because it would overwhelm your system to try to support that many kids that are scoring in the yellow. That is very different than this middle school that I told you. This is a doable percentage. So like thinking about 6% or 7% of the kids that might have tier 2, or about less than 3% of the kids that have tier 3 needs. So one thing I can do is just quickly to see, is this a tier 1 issue? The next thing you can do is you're going to want to look at multiple sources of data together. These are fictitious students' names. So these are not real kids' names. But when we keep talking about externalizing and internalizing, I want to emphasize these are just screeners. We're also going to want to pull in information about like how kids are reading and how they're doing in math, how many office discipline referrals they've earned, and how much time they've missed from school. And then I want to look at the total source of information for this child. So looking at a kid like Tam, this child has tier 3 needs for reading, tier 2 needs for math, tier 2 needs for externalizing and internalizing. The kids earned a lot of office discipline referral, and they've missed quite a few days of schools. There was a study done by Hill Walker, and it showed that if kids miss 10 days of school or more, regardless of the reason, they are more likely to experience challenges in school, like not experience school success. So if I looked at all of this information and ignored attendance, I would be in trouble. I'd miss something important. For these kids that are showing up in the red or in the yellow, one of my first priorities is to help get them to school and help them sustain all day. Because we know that if kids are not attending regularly, we would expect them to be behind academically. So I wanted to show you this just to show you an integrated way to be able to look at multiple sources of data on reading and math and externalizing and internalizing and office discipline referrals and absenteeism. And then if that is what your class looked like, then I need to go think about what can I do for that teacher? And I'd be asking myself, if that was my classroom, if that was a 5th grade class that I had taught, I would be asking myself, what can I do to maximize instruction and minimize disruption? So I might jump on to this part of the website, this professional learning tab, and look to see what low intensity supports can I start to incorporate into my teaching to maximize engagement. And if you go on to these, you can find very practical resources, such as like how to build in increased opportunities to respond or build in instructional choices. There have been studies that have shown that even having like 5 problems on the board when kids come in as a starting activity and say, pick any 3 you want to do, or pick the one you want to start with first, just those simple choices are enough to maximize engagement and minimize disruption. I also want to recognize that for many people, we've also been helping kids in remote learning environments and helping families to learn some of these strategies. And if that's of interest to you, you might look at some of these resources on how to use these same strategies in home settings to also facilitate very positive, productive relationships at home. And when we think about these low intensity supports, they're powerful in the sense that they're just small shifts, like building in choices. And it's not, the choice isn't, hey, do you feel like working today? The choice is like, which one of these two things do you want to start with? Or it might be, do you want to use crayons or sparkly markers? Or do you want to do that independently with a friend? Or do you want to pick your own book for this next book report? But there's guidance on how to do these, and you'll find infographics, step-by-step checklists, and videos. And so earlier, when we talked about using these low intensity supports, there's guidance to every single person. And a lot of people will go out and provide professional learning on these, but if there's step-by-step instructions on how to do these. And some of the schools that we've worked with also take this opportunity to empower educators in their building, where 2 people will be the on-site people that are going to be the go-to people to teach people how to do behavior-specific praise. Another 2 people might be responsible for being the on-site coaches for how to do instructional choices. Another 2 people might be the go-to people on how to do increased opportunities to respond for students. So if you are taking notes or thinking about things you want to go back to later, this would be another 15-minute block that I would encourage you to schedule, where you could take a deep dive into those resources. And some people will do it that they do a strategy a month. So if they're in school for 10 months of the school year, 9 months of the school year, they'll do one strategy each month so that they take the time to build teachers' capacity over the course of the school year. Some of the districts that we've worked in, they do 2 strategies a year. They do one in fall, one in spring, and then they add those resources to teachers' repertoires over time. And then the next piece and the final piece I want to talk about in terms of systematic screening is how you use these screening data to connect kids to these tier 2 and tier 3 supports. And thank you so much for posting that website. I'm glad you're able to find those resources there. When you think about tier 2, I'd like you to think about it as far as intensity. So I want to tell you a little bit of story to frame your thinking. People used to think that tier 2 meant a small group intervention, and that tier 3 meant like an individualized intervention. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, but I want you to think inclusively about how to do these. This is an example of a CrossFit gym. And I know CrossFit is a popular sport across the world. And my daughter, I have 2 children, Nathan, who is 26, and Katie, who is 22. And my daughter is a competitive athlete. And before she graduated from high school and went on to college, I had said to her, I want to spend time with you. And she's like, Mom, if you want to spend time with me, that'd be great. I'm like, why don't we go to like a yoga class or something? And she's like, no offense, Mom, but yoga's kind of for older ladies. I don't want to do that. I'm like, okay, well, how about we try Zumba? So we went to this Zumba place, and I thought it went very well. And she's like, that can never happen again. I don't want to watch you do these dance moves. And she's like, if you want to spend time with me, this is the place to go. And this is where she worked out. And she is an Olympic weightlifter. So she does very heavy weights, and she does CrossFit, which is constantly varied functional fitness at high intensity. So it's a combination of cardio, weightlifting, and gymnastics. And I remember the first time I went into this workout with her, one of the first things that the coach said is, we're going to do some pull-ups. So Katie went up to that bar, and she's very strong. So she was doing multiple pull-ups, no sweat. And I went over to the bar and I put my hands up, and I'm 55 now, I was 48 at the time. And my body didn't move. And so the coach said, come here, Kathleen, I want to try something. And he got this very large rubber band, and I put my foot in there. Then I tried to pull, and still nothing happened. So then he got a second very large rubber band. I put my foot in that, and all of a sudden I could do it. I could pull, and my chin was getting over the bar. The next thing that happened was handstand push-ups. So my daughter got on that wall, and she was doing upside down handstand push-ups, and I couldn't do any of that. So he brought a box over, and I leaned on the box. He's like, go like this to approximate a push-up. And I'm like, great. And I share these with you because at no point did he say, you're too old, you're not strong enough, you can't be here, and send me out of that gym. Instead, he looked for a way to help me get as close as possible to the movements that the rest of the class was doing. And over time, I got stronger. I'm still doing it. I was never made to feel marginalized or not good enough. And I'm still doing this. And she's since gone off and graduated college. In a CI3T system, I encourage you to think about tier 2 and tier 3 supports, like those big rubber bands and the boxes. So for every extra support in your building that is offered, not for everybody, but for some, ideally, you are going to define what that support is, like a self-monitoring intervention. You describe what it is. And now, instead of it being a guess or a teacher nomination as to who needs that, we're going to use your school-wide screening data together to see who might need more than tier 1 has to offer. And then any kid that gets this extra support, we're going to again look at those 3 things. What does the student think about it before you start? Social validity. Because like if a student tells you up front, this would be so embarrassing to have like a self-monitoring checklist on my desk, then we're not going to do that because they're not going to want to do it anyway. And then I want to know, is it happening? Is it being implemented as planned? That's treatment integrity. And is it working for students? And then there has to be a plan for when it's over. And this isn't just behavioral supports. It's also like for reading intervention. So I might have like a self-monitoring intervention with a reading intervention. So if I have a child that struggles to pay attention, they might come to the table to do a targeted tier 2 intervention with a teacher. And they might have this little self-monitoring form that goes with them that says, did I come to the table when the teacher called my name? Did I read my book? Did I practice my trick sounds? Did I tap my letters? And then if they meet 5 out of 6 of those, they get an acknowledgement for meeting expectation. And even if they had a terrible day, if their ratings matched their teacher's ratings, like if they saw the same thing, you would still recognize them for being honest about how that day went. And when we talk about treatment integrity, this is what it would look like on the teacher's side. So she might have 2 kids at that reading group that are getting that extra support. And then these are reminders to the teacher of, did I prompt the students to complete their checklist? Did I compare my list to theirs? And did they give them the tickets? So when we talk about tier 2 or tier 3 and a CI3T support, each of these grids is explaining to teachers the extra thing that is done that is of additional intensity to support engagement, minimize disruption, maximize academic achievement. So at the high school, that tier 2 support might be connecting to kids to a Read 180 program, or it might be a mentoring program that has no end date, because the idea would be to help kids negotiate that final push to do well through high school. On one of the schools we worked with, they had a requirement where every single student had to pass Algebra 2. And so their entry criteria was that this was for any 12th grade student, which is the last year of formal education in the United States. Anytime their grade fell below a certain threshold, they would get this extra support. And when we think about tier 3, that really intensive supports, it would be the same logic. The interventions are just more intensive. Many of you have probably heard of functional assessment-based interventions, where you're determining the maintaining function of a behavior, and then you're designing an intervention based on the reason why the behavior challenges. It would still get written up in a CI3T model like this. And then these might be the data that I collect on a student during baseline, when an intervention's in place, when it's removed, and where it's put back in. But that intervention is customized to that student's multiple needs. And if you're interested in reading more about that, we have a special issue in Beyond Behavior that might be of use to you. Also, we have multiple resources available on this tab. It's called Functional Assessment-Based Intervention. And that's another tab where you can go to access videos and all the implementation checklists that you would need to put that particular intervention in place. And so as you're thinking about all this, and as we're wrapping up this webinar for today, I'd like you just to keep an open mind. I'd like you to think about planning for next steps. Like, go back to some of those timers that I gave you, and hopefully you've slotted some times out in your personal calendar. You might think about learning more about building a CI3T model. You might decide that you're going to do a little bit more in checking out systematic screening if you think that's something that might be of use to you. You might also take time to go look at some of the newly posted resources on pbis.org, which is the second website I meant to mention to you. And on there, you can find resources about how to pick out a screening tool, how to communicate with your community about it, how to install it, how to use the data to shape instruction. And please remember, this is a journey. This would take an entire academic year to put together. And this is an interactive ebook that you could, if you wanted to, purchase off of like the iStore if you have iProducts, or you could do a hard copy of a different type of book called the School-Wide Book. But the idea would be, you might think about this as a possibility to build out this system in your school. And if you decide you're going to do that, whoever the governing body is above your school, like the superintendent at the United States, like in the district office, like they have in the United States, they have these district offices, and then schools constitute together this entity that's organized by those people. You're going to want to talk to your district leaders to make sure that they are supportive of this type of work. And remember, it's not enough just to build it. We'd have to install it. So everything that we've talked about today about giving teachers in your school a voice about what they think about the goals, the procedures, and the outcomes. What pieces are they putting in place in terms of treatment integrity and social validity, and how is it working for kids? And remembering that there will be continued growth for your own knowledge, for your own professional learning, to learn more about tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 practices. And it's not a one-person journey. It's a team. It's a team from your school that is interacting with all the faculty and staff that are there. So if these are things that are interesting to you, we hope that you will continue your journey of exploring integrated tiered systems, such as comprehensive integrated 3-tier models of prevention. We host free access professional learnings several times a year, usually about 5 to 6 times a year. So if you're interested in those, you are welcome to click onto our tab and learn more about the offerings. They'll be posted shortly next month. And then again, please keep posted on both ci3t.org and pbis.org. But we want to just thank you so much for listening and learning to some of the research that we've been doing since 1996, as we have explored the design, implementation, and evaluation of CI3T models. And with that, I will just, again, thank you for the gift of your precious time, and I look forward to fielding any questions that you might have.
Professor Lynne, thanks so much for an insightful presentation and the clear practical messages on how to structure the CI3T approach and the critical importance of screening to support students during their school years. We now move to our discussion part. There's a list of questions here that some colleagues of mine have already shared through emails. In case I've seen more questions any questions on the chat, I will share those as well. Again, if you are listening, watching us, and you want to pose your question and you want to pose it in Greek, please do that, and I will translate it in English and ask Professor Lynne. Our first question has to do with the idea of some staff buy-in or resistance that we get from teachers about the teaching behavior skills the way we teach academic skills. And oftentimes we get this attitude that I'm an effective classroom teacher, most of my students follow my instructions, and in general they behave. Why should I have to teach them social skills? How would you respond to those questions?
That's a great question. And I do understand some people come into that, and I am somebody that prepares teachers. And I remember many times, especially like in the late 90s, early 2000s, people would say, why would I need to know anything about behavior or social emotional well-being? I am a teacher. I'm going to go teach them this academic content. What we know is how you teach influences how kids behave, and how they behave is going to influence how you teach. And so if you choose not to explicitly teach expectations for behavior and give kids opportunities to practice and receive reinforcement, then they're going to do what they know how to do to get your attention or to escape things that are too hard or too easy. So you will manage behavior one way or the other. You can either spend time teaching it so that you can spend less time responding to challenging behaviors, or you can spend more of it on what's like consequence-based things. Because in the 1970s, people didn't take this like teaching on the front side, if you will. But you actually buy back instructional time by taking the time to build kids' skills in terms of how they get along with others and how to get along successfully with you and knowing how to play the school game in each environment. You're actually contributing to really positive relationships with students, and it allows them to set the stage for these very positive, productive learning environments. The other thing I want to say, which is an extension of your question, is that we need to think about what's good for teachers as well, especially at a time when many people are leaving this profession. And we've done studies about how teachers fare in these CI3T models. And we've done studies at the elementary as well as middle and high school level. And we're getting ready to replicate these this coming year. And we have learned that when teachers have this in place for about 2 years and they get to about 75 to 80% fidelity, we see that teachers have lower burnout rates than the national averages and a higher sense of self-efficacy, meaning efficacy in their teaching, which means not only is this good for kids, it's also good for adults. So I encourage people to read a little bit more and keep an open mind about taking the time to invest in both those behavior and social components so that we can together make sure that we're maximizing the academic outcomes for kids. And those data, like looking at how screening data predict academic outcomes, think about that. In all those schools where you see the green getting bigger over time, we know that those scores actually predict academic failure and academic success. So if we really care about moving the needle for kids academically, we need to invest in teaching them these behavior and social and emotional well-being skill sets.
Great. As I listening you to articulate with evidence and data about the importance of screening and supporting teachers and connecting students to get the right support, I'm also thinking that there is a great and continuous talk here in Europe about including all students in the same classroom environment. And this is the notion of inclusive education. And there's a great push for making changes at the policy level as well as at the classroom level. Would you consider the structure of the CI3T approach as an applied example of inclusive education?
Great question. I do think that this structure can support inclusive environments. And I also think it supports equity work when we think about making sure that kids get access to what they need. So moving away from the idea that, every kid needs the exact same thing. Fair is not always equal. And part of this gives opportunities for every educator, like principals, general ed teachers, special education teachers, to communicate about how they plan to reach every single student at tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And I think about it all the time about potential benefits of this structure for inclusive programming. So if we're taking the time to teach all those skills about how to be successful and how to be engaged and how to be responsible in school, when we teach all those at tier 1, I know there's going to be some kids that need more than that. But now when they go to a tier 2 support, they're going to build on the lessons learned at tier 1. So they're going to go deeper at tier 2 and deeper at tier 3. So it's not bringing in new language systems. It's actually going deeper. So I think about a school counselor, a school psychologist can go and say, what's been taught at tier 1? What are those lessons? What does this kid need? And they can do a diagnostic to see what they need more of. And then when they go at tier 2, now this kid is going to get more support learning these base skills. And now the teacher can be on the lookout so that when they're in the inclusive education experience, they know what to look for. So they know what to acknowledge to that kid for meeting those expectations. Because I think a lot of the reasons why social skills and things like that didn't work very well in decades ago is because kids were getting pulled out of general education settings, taught all these skills that were disconnected from what was happening at tier 1. And then these kids would go back in, try out these new skills. And it didn't make any sense because the teacher didn't know what they were doing. Other kids didn't recognize it. But when I have this culture where every single kid is learning those same strategies about how to make your needs known in a respectful way, how to, regulate, know what my body feels like when I'm feeling anxious or I'm feeling stress. And then they can support each other. That's how we're going to program for generalization of those skills that are taught and practiced and reinforced elsewhere.
Thank you so much. I have a question related to the barrier of Tier 1 implementation. You said earlier during your presentation the importance of schools, school districts, educational systems to invest on these systems approach across all the 3 different levels. And what happens when you start setting up the structures for each tier, and then at some point a third of your school staff, including administration or classroom teachers, relocates to other schools during the implementation process?
Yep.
How do we
I'm
support?
so glad you asked that. I'm so glad you asked that, because part of the beauty of having all this written into like a document that says like, here's what it looks like in our school or in our district, like that CI3T implementation manual, that includes like your historical knowledge of what's going to happen at tier 1. And now we have another grant that we're in mid-cycle for. It's called Project Enhance, and it's also funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. And as part of that, we are building professional learning resources to support exactly those things. Like, how do you onboard people into a new system? Like, how do you hire a principal or a superintendent, or how do you hire a teacher and then teach them, here's what this system looks like. And I have to say, we have these amazing district partners right now. We have one of the projects that we have is with 4 school districts in 2 different states in the United States of America. And now when they do job searches, like when they're searching for teachers or searching for principals, they let them know we're part of a CI3T system. So they're advertising their jobs, and then they're onboarding them into these new systems. And some of the schools, they even have it in their new teacher induction that they teach them what it means to come into that system. One of the principals that we worked with for years, and now she's a consultant on, or one of our research team members, that when she would welcome new people into her building, she would, after they got hired, she would give them a copy of the CI3T implementation manual. She would go over the big ideas of what they needed to know. She would talk about the first days of schools, but she did these little meetings with them. So there is a whole suite of onboarding procedures. And I want to say one of our long-term partners that we've been working with for, I think we just finished our 9th year with them. They've had 8 different superintendents, which is like the head of the entire district. And this system sustains because they've built a system that involves onboarding and creating clarities, and it's a commitment to ongoing professional learning. You don't just design this and launch it and let it go. It does require ongoing professional learning, and that's partly what we're doing with Project Enhance. And we're currently setting up for 2 studies that'll take place this coming year for the next 2 years. And then when those lessons are learned, we will post all that for free as well as on our website. So please do stay tuned to learn more about what that will look like.
We surely will do so.
Great.
One more question. So you discussed in your presentation about implementing the CI3T approach, not only in at the elementary school level as well as all the way through high school. What are the main lessons that you've learned by implementing this approach at the middle and high school level? Because the way the teachers operate there is not the same as at the elementary level.
Yeah. And I will say we've had as many partners at the middle and high school as we have elementary. And that's actually one of our very first federally funded grants where this started was in high schools. And time's not going to permit me to go into a tremendous amount of detail, but I showed you several studies today from elementary, from middle, and from high school. And when implemented with fidelity, we see those decreases in risk in buildings like elementary, middle, and high. And we know those fall scores do predict end of the year outcomes. And we have another tab on our website called CI3T in Action. And there's banks of videos of actual implementers. There's some from like elementary, middle, and high school. And I have to say, some of the people that I have just had the greatest honor of working with have been middle and high school principals that have just done these incredible jobs. And even things like, bringing in students into the planning and the implementation process has just been just a gift to watch how these people have led. So I would encourage you to check on that website, and you can listen to these short little videos. Some of them are like a minute, some of them are 2 minutes. And then we also have panel discussions from implementers, including people from the district office, so that you could hear from them like what their lessons were as they rolled out throughout the years. We also have, if you just search my name, Kathleen Lynne, you can read about implementation efforts, particularly systematic screening in elementary, middle, and high schools as well. And we have multiple illustrations about how to look for kids and do targeted interventions. And we, for example, have some randomized control trials of like writing interventions taking place at tier 2. We have done studies using single case methodology to deal with kids that have really intensive intervention needs. There's one by Caitlin Majeka that's a high school illustration about functional assessment-based intervention. So I'd be happy to connect people to those resources as well. And I would also like to just close by saying we also host monthly CI3T trainer and coaches calls, and they're open. Anybody can come in. There's no long-term commitment. It's not a research opportunity. It's just something we do as a service. And on our website, on that professional learning tab, we have one more for this year that comes up, I think the first or second week of June. And then we'll be announcing new dates. And it's just an hour, and you can log in and meet other implementers and ask questions there as well.
And where can we find that? Is it under the professional learning tab?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And if you scroll down, and actually, let me see if I can just pull that up for you. I'll show you where it is before we close. And then can you see this website on your screen?
It's coming up. Yes.
Okay. So if you click on the professional learning tab, this is where next year's professional learnings will offering that is as a service will be there. And then they're also recorded. And then we will very shortly have this updated, but we have one more for this year. But if you download this, it is a PDF that says when these dates and times are. And you can just click here to register. And these are for these little 1 hour times and talks.
Excellent.
Yeah. So I think, let me just pull one up to show you what it looks like. It's a pretty colorful document. And we have teachers and administrators. And our last one for the year is coming up on June 2nd. And you can just email either of these two wonderful leaders that run that project for us. So great.
We thank you very much. This is very useful. And we can share it also with our graduate students as well, because what you have been presenting with us today is part of, we try to make it part of our graduate courses content as well.
Oh, wonderful.
This concludes our discussion for today, Professor Lynne. Just a very final thought. Could you please share with us some final words of wisdom to all those teachers, educational stakeholders, researchers, that they are working tirelessly to make a change in their school buildings, to change structures in order to create a positive, safe, and consistent school environment?
Yeah. And I would like to close just by thanking them. So teaching is, I think, both an art and a science. And I think there is truly no greater job than one can have to be the person that is so fully committed to meeting kids' multiple needs so that they can go on to define their own goals for their life and help them to become self-determined lifelong learners. And I want to emphasize, your job is complex, but it is very possible given the educational science community that is generating new information. And I just truly want to thank people for being willing to pivot to a system where you can work with other talented people like yourselves to define what you want that experience to be for the adults in the building, as well as the students themselves. And I would encourage people to embrace the idea of screening. We want to look for kids at the very first sign of concern when behaviors are most malleable. We want to find kids before reading becomes too hard. We want to find kids before internalizing or externalizing issues become too challenging. And it's you. I mean, when parents drop off their kids to you, they're with you, awake 7.5 hours a day. It is truly just a joyous gift. And I want to thank you for staying with your job in these very complicated times as we navigate the pandemic era. And I hope that our paths will cross again soon. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you too. Now, please let me share my screen to give a few reminders to our audience for next time. Professor Lynne's webinar has already been recorded, and you may access it and the previous one via our webpage below, which is in the yellow highlighted part. You can sign up to receive news and email reminders for our forthcoming webinar. The form is at the bottom of the webpage. Our last webinar is on June 16, Professor Habe, and her topic will be autism, thinking about mental health needs and under recognition in girls. You can also follow our department's Facebook and Instagram pages with that name. With that, we thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for taking the time to listen to us. Any questions and comments, post in the chat box. Those of you who have not been able to be live with us today and you still have questions, feel free to email those to us and we can forward that to Professor Lynne as well. We look forward to seeing you on our next and last upcoming webinar for the rest of the academic year. Professor Lynne, warmest thanks for your time, for sharing all this wealth of knowledge and research expertise around system change approach and building positive school-wide cultures.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for including me. I appreciate it. Be safe.